uses the drug and who is perceived to use the drug, right? That's what distinguishes how we treat these laws, these drugs in our laws. Even, quite frankly, alcohol prohibition. I mean, alcohol prohibition, to some extent, was about a broader social conflict between the white Americans and the not-so-white Americans. Right? The white Americans coming over from Northern and Western Europe in the late 18th and 19th century, and the not-so-white Americans coming over from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, flooding into our country the way the Mexicans and Central Americans are today, and freaking everybody out and bringing with them their beer and their vino and their Schlitowitz. That cultural conflict. And it's not as if the white Americans weren't drinking. It's just that there was also an understanding that even if you were drinking, you were not going to be the target of these criminal laws, right? That inevitably, that when you punish a behavior like this, a behavior that is widely violated, widely engaged in, then inevitably there will be discretion in the enforcement of the laws. I mean, the classic mistake that African American leadership has made in this issue over and over and over and over again is coming out of the black churches and believing in the immorality of various behaviors that they believe are prohibited from the Bible, right? And then calling for prohibition laws without ever thinking that every time they invite in a prohibition law, they are ineffectively inviting in a disproportionate targeting of their people, of African Americans, for the enforcement of these laws. That's always been the case. It's always been the case. Criminalize something that many people will do, and some people, the cops are going to look right through or not target on unless they're very unlucky or stupid or whatever. And other people, cops are going to be all over them. All over them. Even if the rates of drug use are equal across these groups, that group's going to be disproportionately targeted for all sorts of reasons. So, these laws that you are smashed in the middle of being quasi-enforcement agents for, they don't have any scientific or intellectual legitimacy in the beginning. You have been, I mean, they may have existed since you were born and before you were born, but their only legitimacy is from their longevity. They don't derive legitimacy from their origins. They don't derive legitimacy from science. They don't. It's not there. So the question is, when you're involved in this process, what role are you supposed to be playing in all of this sort of stuff? What is this role of pain? You know, I sometimes hold you guys out as role models because you are, in some respects, more advanced and more sophisticated than, and more flexibility than people dealing with addiction to opiates, addiction to heroin. Right? Sometimes when I talk to people involved in the field of addiction treatment, I'm trying to get them to open up, especially with respect to addiction to opiates. And I'll say, you know, if you go to a doctor, or you're going to a doctor because somebody you love is in profound pain, and the doctor says to you, well, what would you prefer I prescribe? Would you prefer that I prescribe fentanyl or Dilaudid? How about Demerol? Methadone is cheaper. You know, and the patient's going to say, doctor, I don't care. I want you to prescribe whatever is going to work best. And work best usually means reduce the pain as much as possible while maintaining their basic humanity, personality of that person, right? That's the basic objective, I believe. Am I right? Is that basically the objective of what you're striving to do? And then if the doctor says, well, how would you like me to administer this? Would you prefer I do it by injection? We could do it orally. We could do it by a patch, a patient-controlled analgesic. We even do lollipops, you know? And he said, doctor, I don't care. All I want you to do is to focus on the bottom line. Reduce the pain as much as possible, enable them to be as much themselves as possible. That's the bottom line. Okay. And I imagine that because many of you hold that out in some respects as your ideal. I think, I hope. Now, and part of the reason I'm saying this is that when you're coming to treating, say, heroin addiction, we know that methadone maintenance, done right, with adequate dosing, with people who are respectful. You know, you have a methadone program which always believes that less is more, which only hires people in 12-step programs, who have contempt for people in methadone programs to work in those things, right? If they're kicking people out because they're testing them for, oh, you tested positive for marijuana, you're out of here, you tested positive for this. I mean, that's not methadone maintenance treatment. That's something else pretending to be methadone maintenance treatment. But when it's done in ways consistent with the scientific evidence, in ways consistent with global practice in this area, with respect for the patient, just focusing on the bottom line, well, then it'll work. But what we know is that even though methadone may work the bestest for the mostest, It's not going to work for everybody. We know that for some group of it's going to work better. But you know, in Germany, I mean, in France, I mean, Germany, they were doing codeine maintenance. They had a ban on methadone a couple decades ago. They were doing codeine maintenance for 50, 60, 70 dollars ago, and it worked. And there have been other places in our country, in our history, of doing morphine maintenance, right? And then, of course, there's the experience with diamorphine, a.k.a. heroin. Right? And the British had always recommended this stuff. You've been able to prescribe the stuff with some flexibility for people who couldn't quit. But what the Swiss began doing in the early 90s, they took people who had tried methamphetamine, hadn't worked, been drug-free, hadn't worked, been in jail, hadn't worked. These were people who were getting to a certain age where, you know, heroin had become the love they couldn't live with and the love they couldn't live without. They had gotten to a point of lives where they didn't want to be hustling on the streets anymore, but they could not imagine living without their dear, precious sex. They weren't getting high that much anymore. It's just to keep from getting sick at this point. And the Swiss said, let's try an experiment. Let's set up clinics where you can go in there and you can get pharmaceutical heroin up to 3 times a day, can't take it home. You know, we'll give you your baseline methadone, we'll give you other meds, you've got HIV, whatever, Hep C, whatever it might be. We'll try to help you in terms of stabilizing your lives. Like a very well-run methadone program, but also allowing pharmaceutical heroin and not allowing them to take it home. And the Swiss found they did this. First in Zurich, then it spread around the country, even small towns, not just big cities. You know, they found that, in fact, it was remarkable that people started not only reducing their illegal heroin use, they started reducing their other illicit drug use. They started withdrawing from the black markets. They stopped getting arrested already. They stopped being involved in sorts of crime. Their health improved. Their sort of disease prevention behavior around HIV, Hep C improved as well. Some of them began to get jobs. Right? There was this incredible stabilization in their lives. Right? I mean, then the Germans started doing it, and it worked there too. And the Dutch, and it worked there too. They also tried it not just with injectable, but smokable heroin, which is how some people do it there, chasing the dragon. And then the Spanish did it, and the British did it, and now the Canadians in Vancouver and Montreal have just finished their NAOMI study, North American Opiate Medication Initiative, and all of them are consistently showing the same results, which is that when you take people who have tried in other ways to stop and they can't do it, and you allow them into this program, what you find is these people are able finally to stabilize their lives for the first time. The cops who were irate when they started are now the biggest champions. Remember, the 60 Minutes did a wonderful thing on this 10 years ago. If you want it, I'll send you a copy and give you my card later. You know, and they found that the police used to say, I thought it was the stupidest thing I ever heard about it. Now I'm its biggest supporter. Why? Because it reduces the acquisitive crime by drug addicts, it reduces the black market, and it actually helps these people, I've come to understand. Right? I mean, that was it. 10 years ago, the cover of Der Spiegel magazine, the German Newsweek, majority of German big city police chiefs now support heroin maintenance, right? For the same reasons. Now, I'm deeply involved in trying to get, because I tried 10 years ago to get this going in America. We got the Canadian leg going, the Canadians ran with it, got money. Now, under the new Obama land era, let's try to move this thing in this area. But what stands in the way? What stands in the way is not science. What stands in the way is not evidence or compassion. What stands in the way is what? It's like, give heroin? Why don't you give booze to boozers? I mean, why don't you? I mean, what stands in the way is ignorance, fear, and prejudice. That's what stands in the way. Right? Now, it seems to me that if we swing this over to the issue of what you're dealing with here on pain, what are you dealing with? First of all, you were dealing with the phenomenon of what I think it was my friend John Morgan who coined the phrase opiophobia, the irrational fear of opioids in our society.